Excuse me, do you have any leftover cake? I don't want my daughter to feel forgotten, even on her birthday.
A billionaire heard a homeless mother whisper one sentence inside a bakery, and 10 minutes later, everything he believed about money, success, and himself began to break apart. Because she didn't ask for money, she didn't ask for help. She asked for something so small that the way people reacted to it revealed who they really were. And the man sitting quietly in the corner was about to make a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Before we continue this story, welcome. If you enjoy emotional stories about justice, kindness, and life-changing moments, take a quick second to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. His name was Andrew Benson. Most people didn't recognize his face, but they knew his name because his businesses were everywhere. Bakeries on busy streets, cafes near office towers, delivery trucks moving before sunrise, 12 bakeries, multiple properties, more money than he could ever spend. And yet that morning, he sat alone in a small corner of the Santa Clara bakery with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Because Andrew Benson wasn't there for coffee. He was there to watch. It was something he had done for years. He would visit his own businesses without telling anyone. Sit quietly, observe, listen. Because people behave differently when they think no one important is watching. And lately, watching people had become the only thing that made him feel anything at all. 5 years earlier, his wife Caroline had died. Slowly, painfully. The kind of illness that doesn't just take a person, it takes every plan you built with them. They had wanted children, waited too long, then found out it was no longer possible, and then she was gone. And Andrew was left with a house that was too big and a life that felt too empty. So he worked, built more, earned more, until one day he realized something terrifying. He had everything and nothing. That morning he sat in the bakery, watching people laugh, talk, live, and feeling completely disconnected from all of it. Until the door opened. The bell rang softly, and everything changed. A woman stepped inside. She paused just for a second, like the smell had hit her all at once. Fresh bread, warm sugar, butter, vanilla. The kind of smell that reminds you of better days. Behind her, a little girl peeked out, maybe 5 years old, wearing a faded pink coat and holding tightly onto her mother's jacket. Andrew noticed them immediately. Not because they were loud, but because they were quiet. Too quiet. The woman looked around carefully, not with curiosity, but with awareness, like someone entering a place where she didn't fully belong anymore. She stepped into line, 4 people ahead of her. She stood straight, said nothing, but Andrew could see it, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands stayed behind her, holding the child. The little girl tugged gently. "Mama," she whispered, "that cake has flowers on it." Andrew followed her eyes. A pink cake, small sugar flowers on top. Perfect. The kind of cake that belongs to birthdays, to families, to people who don't have to think about the price. The mother looked at it, then smiled softly. "Yes, it does." The girl stared at it like it was magic. Andrew felt something shift inside him, and he didn't know why. The line moved, slowly, one person, then another, until finally the woman stood at the counter. The manager barely looked at her. Next, she stepped forward, and for a moment, she didn't speak, like she was choosing her words carefully. "Today is my daughter's birthday." She turned slightly. The little girl peeked out. "I don't have money to buy a cake." A pause, but I was wondering. Her voice stayed steady. "Do you have any leftover cake?" Silence. "Anything from yesterday that you were going to throw away. Even a small piece, it doesn't have to be much." The manager stared at her. Then suddenly he laughed. Loud, sharp, cruel. "You want free cake?" A few people turned. Some smirked. Some looked away. The little girl tightened her grip. The woman didn't move. "Leftover cake," she repeated calmly. The manager called another employee over. "Come listen to this." Now people were watching, phones slightly raised. "This woman walked in here asking for free cake." More quiet laughter. Andrew's hand tightened around his cup. The woman stood there, still, holding her dignity like it was the last thing she had left. The manager leaned forward. No money, no cake. The girl looked up at her mother. Her eyes changed. Confusion, embarrassment, pain. The woman nodded once. Thank you, and she turned. No argument, no begging, no scene. She just left. The little girl followed, and the bell rang again. Andrew didn't move, not immediately, because something inside him had just shifted, not loudly but deeply. Then he stood up, walked out, and followed them. At a distance, they walked for a long time, turned into smaller streets, then smaller ones, until the city changed. Older buildings, broken sidewalks, fewer people, and then a bridge. Andrew slowed, because what he saw next, he would never forget. Under that bridge was their home. Cardboard, blankets, a plastic bag. That was everything. The little girl ran toward it, like it was normal, like it was safe, like it was enough. Andrew felt his chest tighten, because now he understood. And suddenly that moment in the bakery was no longer small. It was everything. He stood there watching the little girl sit down and begin drawing in the dirt with a stick. A house, a tree, a door. Andrew looked away for a second, because something about that was too much. Then he reached for his phone and made a call. I need everything about her, he said quietly, because in that moment, he made a decision. And what he would discover next would shock him even more than what he had just seen. Andrew didn't start the car right away. He just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the road like it was no longer the same place. Because 10 minutes ago, that street had just been part of his city. Now it felt like a line between two completely different worlds. One where people complained about coffee being too cold, and one where a child drew her dream house in the dirt. He exhaled slowly, then finally started the engine. But even as the car moved, his mind stayed under that bridge. That night he didn't sleep, not properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the little girl, the way she said it. That cake has flowers on it. Not asking, not demanding, just noticing. And somehow that made it worse. Because it meant she wasn't expecting it. She was just looking. Morning came quietly, too quietly. His house felt bigger than usual, emptier. He stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand. His phone rang. James, Andrew answered immediately. I have information, James said. Andrew didn't sit down. Tell me. There was a pause. Not hesitation, but careful pacing. Her name is Margaret Christine. Andrew closed his eyes briefly. 38, former employee at Hartley's grocery store. Worked there 6 years, stable. Andrew turned slightly, listening more closely now. She had an apartment, paid rent on time, small savings account, a pause. She had a normal life. Andrew's voice lowered. What happened? James didn't rush. There was a man. Andrew didn't react. Name is Rodrigo. Relationship lasted about 2 years. Another pause. There are hospital records. Andrew's grip tightened slightly. 3 visits. Broken wrist, listed as a fall. 2 more, unclear causes. Silence filled the room. Heavy, uncomfortable, real. And the last visit? Andrew asked quietly. 18 months ago. After that, she was placed in a shelter. Andrew frowned. Was? She left after 2 weeks. Andrew's jaw tightened. Why? James hesitated, just slightly. She believed Rodrigo found the location. She didn't want to risk the other women. Andrew looked down at the floor. That told him everything. What about her documents? Andrew asked. Gone, James said. All of them. Left behind when she ran. Another pause. Without ID, she can't get a job. Without a job, no housing. Without housing, no way to rebuild documents easily. It's a loop. Andrew leaned against the counter slowly. And Rodrigo? He's still in the city. No restraining order. No formal case. She never stayed in one place long enough. Andrew didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said one sentence. Calm, controlled, final. We fix it. James didn't question it. What do you need? Andrew grabbed a pen. 3 things. A top-tier family lawyer. Someone who handles protection cases. He wrote quickly. I need to know the fastest legal path to restore identity documents. Another line. And I want a job training program. Something real, not charity, something that leads to stability. He paused, then added quietly, today. James responded instantly. Understood. The call ended. Andrew stood there very still. Then he whispered something, not to anyone else but to himself. This time we do it right. He didn't go back to the bridge that day or the next, because he understood something most people didn't. Giving someone a meal solves a moment. Giving someone structure changes a life. So he worked. Calls, meetings, quiet arrangements. By the end of day 1, he had a name. Patricia Cole, 20 years of experience, known for not losing cases like this. He called her personally, explained only what mattered. By day 2, he had an apartment, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, quiet street, near a school, paid 3 months in advance, not in his name, in hers. That mattered to him. It had to be hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not something that could be taken back. By day 3, everything was ready, and only then he returned. The morning was cold, the city still half asleep. Andrew parked 2 streets away and walked the rest. Same route, same bridge, same silence underneath. And then he saw her, not Margaret, the girl, Sophia, sitting on the ground, drawing again. Same stick, same careful lines. Andrew slowed his steps. She looked up, not afraid, just curious. Hello, she said. Andrew crouched slightly, keeping distance. Hello. He nodded toward the drawing. That's a good one. She looked down proudly. It's a house. He smiled gently. I can see that. She pointed. That's the tree. Andrew nodded seriously. Very good tree. She studied him, then asked, Are you lost? Andrew shook his head. No, I'm looking for your mother. Before she could answer, he felt it. That presence behind him. He turned. Margaret stood there, still, watching him carefully. Her eyes moved from him to Sophia, then back again. Who are you? She asked quietly. Andrew stood slowly, hands visible, voice calm. My name is Andrew Benson. I was in the bakery 3 days ago. Something shifted in her expression. Not emotion, defense. You saw everything, she said? Yes. Silence. What do you want? She asked. Andrew didn't rush. To talk. She studied him, long, carefully. I'm listening. He gestured toward a low ledge. May I sit? She nodded once. He sat, hands on his knees. Calm. Then he said it clearly. I own that bakery. The words landed heavily. Margaret's eyes changed. You own it? She repeated. Yes. A pause. I saw what happened, he said. Her jaw tightened. Then you saw me get humiliated. Andrew shook his head slightly. I saw someone treated unfairly. She didn't respond. I want to fix it, he said. I don't need pity, she replied immediately. I'm not offering pity. That made her pause. I'm offering something else. And then he explained everything. The apartment, the lawyer, the documents, the program, a job, a real path forward, step by step, no pressure, no conditions. Sophia sat back down, continuing her drawing, like none of this was unusual. Margaret didn't move, but her eyes told everything. Hope, fear, doubt, exhaustion. Finally, she asked one word. Why? Andrew looked at Sophia, then back at her. Because I have more than enough, he said quietly, and you have almost nothing. A pause. And because your daughter, he looked at the drawing, shouldn't have to imagine a house in the dirt. Silence. Long. Heavy. Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at Andrew. I've had people offer help before, she said softly. It never ends the way they say. Andrew nodded. I understand. I can't prove anything right now. He leaned slightly forward. But you can come see it. Meet the lawyer. I'll check everything. You decide. Another long silence. Then she said slowly, If anything puts my daughter at risk, Andrew didn't hesitate. You walk away. That was enough. Margaret turned to Sophia. Pack your things. Sophia looked up. Are we coming back? Margaret looked at the cardboard shelter, the blankets, the life they had survived, then shook her head. No. Sophia stood up, placed her stick next to the drawing. Okay. Andrew watched her, and for the first time in years, he felt something real again. But he didn't know yet that this decision was only the beginning. Because what would happen next would not just change their lives, it would change him completely. Margaret did not move immediately after saying yes. In that moment, that small pause held more weight than anything else that had been said, because for years, every decision she made had been about survival, where to go, where to hide, how to stay unnoticed, how to keep her daughter safe one more day. And now, for the first time, she was making a decision about moving forward, not just staying alive. She looked around the space under the bridge, the cardboard, the blankets, the small things they had collected piece by piece, not because they wanted them, but because they had nothing else. And for a second, just a second, there was hesitation. Not because she doubted Andrew, but because leaving this place meant letting go of the only version of control she had left, even if that control was fragile, even if it was built on hardship. It was still something she understood, something predictable, and stepping away from that meant stepping into the unknown again. Sophia didn't feel that weight, so she picked up their bag, small, light, everything they owned fitting into it without effort. She stood next to her mother and asked simply, "Are we going now?" Margaret looked down at her, then back at Andrew, and finally nodded. "Yes," she said, and that one word changed everything. The car ride was quiet, not uncomfortable, but careful, like three people adjusting to a new reality that hadn't fully settled yet. Sophia sat in the back, her eyes wide as she looked out the window, watching the city change again, but this time in reverse, from broken sidewalks to clean ones, from silence to movement, from shadows to light. "Mama, look," she whispered softly, pointing at a small bakery they passed. "They have cakes too." Margaret nodded. "Yes, they do." But her voice was different now. Not heavy, not guarded, just present. Andrew drove steadily, not speaking much because he understood that not every moment needed to be filled with words. Sometimes silence gives people space to adjust, to think, to breathe. When the car stopped in front of the apartment building, Sophia leaned forward slightly. "Is this it?" she asked. Andrew nodded. "Yes," he said, stepping out and opening the door for them. Margaret stepped out slowly, her eyes moving across the building, not with excitement, but with evaluation. Always checking, always measuring safety, exits, surroundings, people nearby, habits that don't disappear overnight, Andrew noticed, but didn't comment, because he knew those instincts had kept her alive. They walked inside, up the stairs, third floor. Andrew stopped at the door, took out the key, and then paused for a brief second before handing it to Margaret, not opening it himself. "You should do it," he said quietly. Margaret looked at the key in her hand, then at him, then back at the door, and something about that moment mattered more than the apartment itself, because this wasn't just about entering a space. It was about ownership, control, choice. She inserted the key slowly, turned it, and opened the door. The apartment was quiet, clean, empty, waiting, sunlight coming through the window, touching the floor gently, like it had been there the whole time, just waiting for someone to arrive. Sophia stepped in first, her steps light, almost careful, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch anything. She walked into the living room, then into the bedroom, then back again. "Taking everything in, Mama," she whispered. "There's a bed." Margaret stepped inside, slowly, her hand still on the door, and for a moment, she didn't move further because this space, this clean, safe, stable space felt almost unreal, like something that could disappear if she moved too quickly. Andrew stayed near the entrance, giving her space, letting her process it in her own time. "There's more," he said gently after a moment. Margaret turned slightly. "What do you mean?" Andrew walked into the kitchen, opened a small cabinet. Inside were basic groceries, bread, rice, milk, simple things, but enough to start. You won't need to worry about food for a while, he said. Margaret looked at it, then back at him. This is too much, she said quietly. Andrew shook his head. No, he replied. This is the beginning. Sophia ran back into the living room, jumped onto the couch, then immediately stood up again like she had done something wrong. Can I sit here? She asked. And Andrew smiled slightly. You can do anything here. Sophia looked at her mother, waiting for confirmation. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, she said. You can. The next hour passed in small movements, placing the bag down, opening windows, touching surfaces, learning the space not as strangers, but as people trying to believe something new was real. Then there was a knock on the door. Margaret froze instantly, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Andrew noticed and raised his hand slightly. It's okay, he said, and opened the door. Patricia Cole stood there, calm, professional, holding a folder. Mrs. Christine? She asked. Margaret stepped forward slightly. Yes, Patricia nodded. I'm Patricia Cole. Andrew told me about your situation. She walked in, sat at the table, and opened the folder. We're going to start fixing things, she said simply. Margaret sat across from her, still cautious, still processing. Patricia spoke clearly, step by step, explaining what needed to be done. Replacement ID, temporary documentation, legal protection, employment verification, each piece building on the next, not rushed, not confusing, just structured, understandable, real. Margaret listened carefully, asking questions when she needed to, not overwhelmed, but focused, because this wasn't a promise anymore. It was a plan, and plans. She could trust more than words. Sophia sat nearby, drawing again, this time not on the ground but on paper. Andrew glanced at it briefly, and what he saw made him pause. It was the same house, but different, cleaner, clearer, with windows, a door, and something new. 3 figures standing in front of it. That evening, after Patricia left, after the documents were signed, after the first real steps had been taken, Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the street below, Sophia asleep in the other room. Andrew preparing to leave. You can stay, Margaret said suddenly. Andrew turned, slightly surprised. I don't want her to wake up and think this disappears, she added quietly. Andrew hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Okay, he said, and as the night settled into that small apartment, something new began to take shape, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, steadily, like a foundation being built one layer at a time. But neither of them knew yet that the past had not fully let go, and that the man Margaret had run from was already closer than they thought. That night was the first time in months, maybe years, that Margaret slept without waking up every hour, without checking her surroundings, without listening for footsteps that weren't there. But even in that sleep, her body didn't fully relax because survival doesn't disappear in one day. It fades slowly, piece by piece, and sometimes it comes back before you expect it. Andrew didn't sleep much either, not because he felt unsafe, but because his mind was active, aware, adjusting to something new. The sound of quiet breathing from the next room, the feeling of being in a place that wasn't built for him, but somehow felt more real than the house he had lived in for years. He sat in the living room for a long time, looking at the drawing Sophia had left on the table. The house, the tree, the 3 figures, and for a moment he understood something clearly. This wasn't just about helping anymore. Morning came softly, sunlight moving across the floor, touching the edges of the room like it belonged there. Margaret woke first, as she always did, her eyes opening slowly, her body checking the space automatically. Walls, door, window, everything still where it should be. She sat up, listening. Silence. Calm silence. Not the kind filled with danger, but the kind filled with nothing at all. And that was new. She stood, Lorraine walked into the living room and saw Andrew sitting there, already awake. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. Andrew looked up, a small smile forming. "I did a little," he replied. Margaret nodded, not questioning it, because she understood that kind of night. Sophia woke next, small footsteps, a yawn, then her voice, soft but clear. "Mama." She walked into the living room, saw Andrew and stopped for a second, then smiled. "You're still here," she said. Andrew nodded. "I said I would stay." Sophia walked over, climbed onto the couch and looked around the room again, like she was making sure it was still real. "We didn't lose it," she whispered. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest for just a second. Then she knelt beside her. "No," she said gently. "We didn't." The morning moved slowly. Breakfast, simple, quiet, but different. Not rushed. Not uncertain, just normal. Andrew left shortly after, not because he wanted to, but because he knew something important. They needed space to build this life without him always present. Help should support, not replace. And as he stepped out of the apartment, he paused for a moment in the hallway, listening to the soft sound of Sophia talking inside, and he realized something that stayed with him long after he left. He didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was stepping out of something he would return to. That same morning, Margaret walked Sophia to school, holding her hand, not tightly, not protectively, but naturally, like it belonged there. Sophia looked up at her as they reached the gate. "Will you come back?" she asked. Margaret smiled softly. "Always," she said, and for the first time, that word didn't feel uncertain. It felt real. She stood there at 3:30 in the afternoon, just like she promised, and when Sophia ran toward her laughing, something inside Margaret shifted again, a small piece of fear, replaced by something stronger. But not everything was quiet. Across the street, a car sat still, engine off, windows slightly tinted. A man inside watched. Rodrigo. He had been there for almost an hour, not moving, not rushing, just watching. He had followed a pattern, not directly, not obviously, but carefully enough to lead him here. And when he saw Margaret step out of the building that morning, clean clothes, steady posture, a child beside her who looked different now, not afraid, not quiet, something inside him shifted too. Not surprise, something darker, something sharper. "She moved on," he muttered to himself. And he didn't like that. Not at all. Because people like Rodrigo don't see others as independent. They see them as something they once controlled, something that doesn't get to change without their permission. And watching Margaret walk like that, as if her life had been rebuilt without him, felt like something had been taken from him. And that made him dangerous. Very dangerous. Later that afternoon, Andrew sat in his office, reviewing reports. Not business reports, different ones. Updates from the security team he had quietly placed around the building. Routine checks, nothing unusual. Everything stable, until one line caught his attention. "Unknown vehicle observed. Parked for extended period. No movement." Andrew's eyes narrowed slightly. "Run it," he said calmly. Within minutes, more information came in. Partial plate, matched pattern. And then a name. Rodrigo. Andrew leaned back slowly. No reaction, no anger. Just focus. Because this was expected. People like Rodrigo don't disappear when things get better. They return, and they test. Andrew picked up his phone, called Patricia. "He's watching," he said. There was a pause, then her voice, steady as always. "Good," she replied. Andrew frowned slightly. "Good?" "Yes," she said, "because now we can act before he does." Andrew's expression shifted. Understanding. This wasn't just a threat. This was an opportunity. A mistake Rodrigo didn't realize he had made. Meanwhile, Margaret and Sophia walked home, unaware of the car that had been there earlier, unaware of the eyes that had followed them. But something small, something instinctive, made Margaret slow down just for a second as they reached the building. She looked around. Saw nothing. Everything normal. Too normal. She shook it off, took Sophia's hand, and walked inside. But as the door closed behind them, somewhere across the street, Rodrigo started his engine. and drove away. Not because he was done, but because he had seen enough. Because now he knew where they were, and what he would do next would not be quiet. Margaret didn't realize anything was wrong that evening, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. Because when danger announces itself, you prepare, you react, you protect. But when it stays quiet, when it watches, waits, and chooses the right moment, that's when it becomes something else entirely. Something harder to stop, something harder to predict. She unlocked the apartment door, stepped inside with Sophia, and closed it behind her the same way she had done every day since they arrived. Mossy calm, routine, controlled. Shoes off, she said gently. Sophia nodded and placed her small shoes by the door, then ran inside, dropping her school bag and grabbing her crayons. The apartment filled with that soft, familiar rhythm again. The kind of normal life Margaret had worked so hard to rebuild. But something inside her, something she couldn't fully explain, didn't settle the same way it had before. She stood near the door for a second longer than usual, listening. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Still, something felt different. She shook her head slightly, forcing the thought away, because fear has a way of returning even when nothing is there, and she refused to let it take control again. Not now, not after everything they had built. She walked into the kitchen, started preparing something simple for dinner. Rice, vegetables, basic, yes, steady, real, and for a moment, everything felt okay again, until there was a knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm, 3 times. Margaret froze. The knife in her hand stopped moving. Her breathing slowed. Every instinct inside her came back at once. Sophia looked up from the floor. "Mama?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Another knock. Same rhythm, same weight. Andrew. That was her first thought. He sometimes came by without calling, but something about the knock didn't feel like him. She walked slowly toward the door, each step careful, measured. Her hand reached the handle, then stopped. "Mama, who is it?" Sophia asked softly. Margaret leaned slightly toward the door. "Who is it?" she asked. Silence. Then a voice. Low. Calm. Too familiar. "Open the door." Everything inside her dropped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just instantly. Rodrigo." Her hand pulled away from the handle like it had been burned. Sophia stood up slowly. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Margaret turned, her face calm, but her eyes different. "Go to the bedroom," she said quietly. Sophia hesitated. Now. Something in her mother's voice made her move immediately. She ran into the room, closed the door. Margaret turned back to the entrance. Another knock. Harder this time. "I know you're in there," Rodrigo said. Her heart was beating fast now, but her voice stayed steady. "You're not allowed to be here." A small laugh came from the other side. "Allowed?" he repeated. "You think rules stop me?" Margaret stepped back slightly, her eyes scanning the room. Phone, table, distance to the door, everything calculating at once. "You need to leave," she said. Silence, then his voice again. "Closer to the door." Or what? That question used to break her, used to make her hesitate, used to make her feel like she had no answer. But this time, she did. "I call the police." Silence again, longer this time. Then a shift, a different tone, lower, more dangerous. "You've changed," he said quietly. Margaret didn't respond. "You think you're safe now?" Her grip tightened slightly. "I am." Another pause. Then a soft knock, almost gentle. "You always come back to me," he said. "That's how this ends." Margaret stepped forward, closer to the door, her voice low, clear. No, that one word didn't shake, didn't break, didn't hesitate. And on the other side, Rodrigo heard it, really heard it, and something inside him shifted. Not anger, not yet, something colder, more focused. "Then we'll see," he said. And then footsteps, moving away, slow, deliberate. Margaret didn't move, not immediately. She stood there, listening, counting seconds. 10, 20, 30. Silence. Real silence. She rushed to the window, pulled the curtain slightly, and saw him, walking across the street, not running, not hiding, just leaving, like he had all the time in the world. Her chest tightened, because she understood something now. He wasn't finished, not even close. Behind her, the bedroom door opened slowly. Sophia stepped out. "Mama!" Margaret turned quickly, knelt down, pulled her close. "It's okay," she whispered. But this time, she wasn't completely sure. That night, Andrew's phone rang, Margaret's name. He answered instantly. "What happened?" Her voice came through, controlled, but different. Now he was here. Silence, not empty, sharp, focused. "Did he touch you?" "No." "Did he come inside?" "No." A pause. "He knows where we live." Andrew stood up immediately. His entire posture changed. "I'm coming," he said. "No," Margaret replied quickly. "He's gone." Another pause. Then she added quietly, "But this isn't over." Andrew didn't argue, because he knew she was right. An hour later, he was standing outside the building, looking at the entrance, the windows, the street, everything. But he wasn't looking with fear. He was looking with calculation, because now this wasn't a situation, it was a problem. And Andrew Benson didn't leave problems unfinished. He made a call. Short, clear. "I want full surveillance," he said. "Everything." Then another call. "Prepare legal escalation." And then one more. To Rodrigo. The line rang. Once, twice, then connected. Had a voice. Annoyed. "Who is this?" Andrew's voice was calm, controlled, but cold. "The man who is going to end this." Silence, then a small laugh. "You think you can?" Andrew cut him off. "You went to her door." Silence. Real silence. Andrew stepped forward slightly. "Now you've made it my problem." And that changed everything. Because Rodrigo didn't understand yet, he hadn't just crossed a line with Margaret. He had crossed a line with someone who had the power to make sure he never came back again. Rodrigo didn't answer immediately after Andrew's last sentence. And that silence was not hesitation, it was calculation. The kind of calculation that happens when someone realizes the situation has changed, but hasn't fully understood how yet. Then finally, his voice came back. Lower, slower. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said. Oh no, Andrew didn't move, didn't react, didn't raise his voice. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," he replied calmly. "And more importantly, I know exactly what you've done." That landed differently, not because of the words, but because of the certainty behind them. Rodrigo didn't respond right away, and Andrew continued. "You showed up at her door," he said. "That was a mistake." A pause. Then Rodrigo scoffed slightly. "It was a visit." Andrew shook his head, even though the other man couldn't see him. "No," he said quietly, "it was a violation." And then he ended the call. No threats, no shouting, just clarity. And that was far more dangerous, because Andrew wasn't reacting emotionally. He was acting strategically. Within the next hour, everything began to move. Patricia Cole filed the emergency violation report, not just based on Margaret's statement, but supported by additional evidence Andrew had already arranged, building surveillance, timestamps, movement tracking from nearby cameras, all of it structured, organized, undeniable. Because in situations like this, the difference between fear and control is documentation, and Andrew made sure there was plenty of it. At the same time, the private security team adjusted their approach. No longer passive observation, now active monitoring, entry points covered, movement patterns recorded, response protocols ready, not visible enough to alarm Margaret or Sophia, but present enough to act immediately if needed. Andrew stood in his office, watching the updates come in one by one, calm, focused, because this wasn't about reacting to what Rodrigo might do next. It was about limiting what he could do at all. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the apartment, the door locked, windows checked twice, Sophia beside her on the couch, drawing quietly, not fully understanding what had happened, but feeling that something was different. Children always feel it, even when they don't have the words for it. "Mama," Sophia said softly, "is the man coming back?" Margaret paused just for a second, then turned toward her, her expression steady. "No," she said, "he's not." Sophia looked at her for a moment, studying her face the way children do when they're trying to decide if something is true. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing, because that was enough for her. Margaret watched her, and in that moment she made a quiet decision, not out loud, not dramatic, just clear inside her own mind. This ends here. Across the city, Rodrigo sat in his car. Abe parked outside a small bar he used to visit. But he wasn't inside. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't distracted. He was thinking, replaying the conversation in his head. Andrew's voice, calm, controlled, not afraid, not defensive, not anything Rodrigo was used to dealing with, because most people in Margaret's position came alone, and that made them easy to control, easy to push, easy to break. But this was different. This time there was someone else, someone with resources, someone who didn't react emotionally, someone who treated this like a problem to solve, not a situation to survive, and that made Rodrigo uncomfortable. But discomfort for someone like him doesn't lead to retreat, it leads to escalation. "Let's see how far you go," he muttered under his breath, starting the engine slowly. He wasn't done, not even close. When back at the apartment, Andrew arrived just before sunset, not rushing, not showing urgency, because he knew something important. Panic spreads quickly, and the last thing Margaret needed was to feel like things were out of control again. He knocked gently this time, a different rhythm, a familiar one. Margaret opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been standing there waiting. Their eyes met, and in that moment, there was no need for explanation. Both of them already understood the situation fully. "He won't come back tonight," Andrew said calmly as he stepped inside. Margaret nodded. "How do you know?" she asked. Andrew placed his phone on the table, showing her the update, monitored location, distance, movement patterns. "Because now he knows we're watching." Margaret looked at the screen, then back at him. "Oh, that's not going to stop him," she said quietly. Andrew nodded. "No," he agreed, "but it will change how he moves." He paused, then added, "And that's what we need." Sophia looked up from the floor. "Are we safe?" she asked again. Andrew walked over, crouched slightly. "Yes," he said, "and we're going to stay that way." Sophia studied his face, then smiled just a little, because something about his tone felt solid, not just words, and she went back to her drawing again, as if that settled everything. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Margaret and Andrew sat in the living room, the same quiet space that had slowly become something more than just a room. "This isn't going to stop with one visit," Margaret said. Andrew shook his head. "No," he replied, "but it's not going to continue the way he expects either." Margaret leaned back slightly. "Sonny, what are you doing?" she asked. Andrew looked at her steady. "I'm closing every path he has," he said. "Legally, financially, physically." A pause, then he added, "And I'm doing it in a way he can't fight back against." Margaret watched him carefully, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not just kindness, not just support, but strength, controlled, precise. The kind of strength that doesn't show itself loudly, but changes outcomes completely. "And if he doesn't stop?" she asked. Andrew didn't hesitate. "Then the system will stop him," he said. And somewhere across the city, as Rodrigo drove through the streets, planning his next move, thinking he still had control, thinking this was still his game, he didn't realize something important. This wasn't his world anymore. And the man he had just challenged now was already 3 steps ahead. Because what Andrew had set in motion was not just protection, it was the beginning of an ending. One that Rodrigo would not be able to escape. Rodrigo didn't wait long. Men like him never do, because once control slips, they try to take it back fast, hard, loud enough to remind everyone who they think they are. And the next move he made was not quiet. It happened the following afternoon. Margaret was at work, sitting behind the front desk, greeting visitors, checking names, doing everything the same way she had every day since she started, steady, composed, normal, and that normality mattered because it meant she wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she wasn't letting fear reshape her life again. But even as she worked, part of her stayed alert, not panicked, not overwhelmed, just aware. And the kind of awareness that comes from experience, not weakness. The lobby doors opened. She looked up automatically, and everything inside her stopped. Rodrigo walked in, not fast, not aggressive, just confident, like he belonged there, like nothing had changed. The guard near the entrance shifted slightly, noticing him, but not reacting yet, because Rodrigo wasn't doing anything illegal. Not yet. Margaret didn't stand, didn't speak. Her hands stayed on the desk, still, controlled, but her eyes locked on him. Rodrigo walked closer, step by step, each one deliberate, each one measured, until he stood directly in front of her, close enough to remind her of the past, close enough to test her. "You look better," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. But underneath it, something darker. Margaret didn't respond, not immediately. The room felt different now, tighter, smaller, like the air had shifted. "You got help," he continued, a small smile. "I was wondering when that would happen." Margaret finally spoke, her voice steady. "You need to leave." Rodrigo tilted his head slightly. "That's not how this works," he said softly. A few people in the lobby began to notice. Not fully, but enough. Margaret pressed a small button under the desk. Silent alert. Security. Rodrigo saw the movement and smiled. "There it is," he said. "That's new." Margaret held his gaze. "You don't get to come here," she said. "You don't get to talk to me. You don't get to decide anything anymore." For a second, just a second, something flickered in his expression. Not anger, recognition. Because this wasn't the same woman. Not even close. But instead of stepping back, he leaned slightly forward, lowered his voice. "So this is who you are now," he whispered. "After everything?" Margaret didn't move. "After everything," she replied. Silence. Heavy. Real. Then security arrived. 2 guards, positioning themselves calmly. "Sir, you need to leave," one of them said. Rodrigo looked at them, then back at Margaret, and for a moment he considered something. Then he stepped back. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood timing. "This isn't over," he said quietly, not loud enough for the guards, only for her. Then he turned and walked out. Just like that, like he hadn't lost, like this was just another step. Margaret stayed still until the doors closed behind him. Only then did her body react. A slow breath, then another. The guard looked at her. "Are you okay?" No, she nodded. Yes. But inside she knew. This had just escalated, not ended. Andrew got the call minutes later. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait. He was already moving. When he arrived, Margaret was still at her desk, working, like nothing had happened. That told him everything. "You should have called me sooner," he said quietly. Margaret looked up. "I handled it," she replied. Andrew nodded slightly. "You did?" A pause, "but he came to your workplace." Margaret's eyes didn't shift. "I know." Silence. Then Andrew leaned slightly closer. "That changes things." Margaret held his gaze. "I'm not running." Andrew shook his head. "I'm not asking you to." A beat. "I'm ending it." That word again. Ending. Not managing, not controlling. Ending. Across the city, Rodrigo sat in his car again, hands on the wheel, thinking. But this time, there was no confidence, no amusement, only tension. Because something had changed. Not just Margaret. The situation, the balance, the control. And for the first time, he felt it. He wasn't ahead anymore. He was reacting. And that made him dangerous. But also vulnerable. Because men like Rodrigo make mistakes when they start losing control. That night, Andrew met with Patricia, not in her office. somewhere quieter, more private. "We have enough now," she said. Andrew didn't respond immediately. "Enough for what?" he asked. Patricia looked at him directly, to stop him. Silence. Then she added, "But we have one shot." Andrew's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you need?" Patricia closed the file. Pressure, legal pressure, financial pressure, and one more mistake from him. Andrew leaned back slowly, understanding. "He'll make it," he said. See, Patricia nodded. "They always do." And as Andrew stepped out into the night, looking at the city lights stretching endlessly in front of him, he understood something clearly. This wasn't just about protecting Margaret anymore. This was about finishing something that should have ended a long time ago. And somewhere, very soon, Rodrigo was going to make that mistake. And when he did, there would be no second chance. Rodrigo didn't plan to make a mistake. Men like him never think they do. They believe every move is control, every step is power, every action is something they can walk away from whenever they choose. But what they don't understand is that control only works when no one is watching closely enough. And now someone was. The next move didn't come immediately. And that was what made it dangerous. Because silence, after escalation, it means planning. 3 days passed. Quiet, too quiet. No calls, no sightings, no movement from Rodrigo's usual patterns. Margaret noticed it. Andrew noticed it more. "He's not gone," Margaret said one evening, standing by the window. Andrew nodded. "No," he replied. "He's waiting." A pause. "And waiting means he's going to try something bigger." That was exactly what Patricia had expected. Everything was already in place. Not visible, not obvious, but precise. The building cameras had been upgraded, entry logs monitored, external surveillance synced with nearby systems, and most importantly, every legal step had been prepared in advance. Because this time, they weren't reacting to Rodrigo. They were guiding him into something he didn't see coming. It happened on a Friday, late afternoon. Margaret left work at the usual time. Same route, same pace, my same routine. And that was intentional, because routine creates predictability, and predictability creates opportunity, but not just for Rodrigo, for Andrew too. Across the street, a car engine turned on. Rodrigo, watching again, tracking again. But this time he didn't stay back. He stepped out and followed, not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to lose her. Margaret felt it before she saw it, that quiet shift in the air, that awareness returning. She didn't turn, didn't react. She kept walking, exactly as planned, because this time she wasn't alone. Hidden cameras picked up everything: movement, distance, timing. Andrew watched it live, from his office, every step, every angle, every second. "Wait," Patricia said beside him. "Not yet." Rodrigo closed the distance. Faster now, closer, more confident. Because in his mind, this was his moment. The moment where control returns. The moment where fear comes back. The moment where everything resets. He reached her, grabbed her arm, not violently, but firmly. "Enough. Now we talk," he said. Margaret stopped, turned slowly, and looked at him. No fear, no panic, just calm. "You just made a mistake," she said quietly. Rodrigo frowned slightly. "What?" And that's when it happened. 2 officers stepped in, from behind. "Rodrigo Alvarez," one said clearly, "you're under arrest for violation of a restraining order and unlawful harassment." For a second, he didn't move, didn't process, because in his mind, that wasn't possible. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. The officer didn't react. "We have video evidence," he replied, "and multiple reports." Rodrigo looked at Margaret, confused, angry, realizing. "You planned this." "Sure," he said. Margaret didn't respond, because she didn't need to. The cuffs clicked, sharp, final, and just like that, the control he thought he had was gone, completely. Across the street, Andrew stood watching, not stepping forward, not interfering, because this moment wasn't his. It belonged to Margaret. Rodrigo was placed into the car. Still speaking, still trying, still not accepting. But it didn't matter anymore, because the system was already moving. And this time, it wasn't slow. Charges were filed immediately, not just for the violation, but for prior incidents, new evidence, witness records, medical history. Everything Patricia had prepared came together like a structure that had been waiting. And now, it was complete. That night, Margaret sat in the apartment, quiet, still, not in fear, not in shock, just still. Sophia sat beside her, drawing again. "Is he gone?" she asked softly. Margaret looked at her, then nodded. Yes. This time, it wasn't a promise. It was the truth. Andrew arrived later. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at her, because some moments don't need words. Margaret looked back at him, and for the first time, there was nothing behind her eyes, no fear, no weight, no past reaching forward. Just peace. "It's over," she said. Andrew nodded slowly. "Yes, but then," he added something, quiet, real. "Now we begin." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Andrew stepped closer. "Not too close, just enough. I didn't just want to protect you," he said. "I wanted to give you a future, a pause, and I think," he hesitated, "not from doubt, from honesty. I think that future includes me." Silence. Soft. Deep. Margaret looked at him. Really looked. Not as the man who helped her, not as someone outside her life, but as someone who had become part of it, without forcing it, without rushing it, just staying. Sophia looked up from her drawing, then stood, walked over, and took Andrew's hand. Simple. Natural. Like it had always been that way. Margaret watched them, and something inside her finally let go. Not just of fear, but of distance. "Then don't leave," she said quietly. And that moment was bigger than everything before it, because this wasn't survival anymore. This wasn't escape. This wasn't protection. This was choice. And for the first time, all three of them were choosing the same thing. But the story wasn't finished yet, because one last moment remained. One that would define everything. One that would turn this from a story about survival into a story about family. The apartment felt different that night. Not quieter, but lighter. Like something invisible had finally been removed. Something heavy. Something that had been sitting in the background of every moment, every decision, every breath. And now it was gone. Margaret noticed it first. Not in a dramatic way. Just small things. The way she moved without checking the door twice. The way she sat down without listening for sounds outside. The way her shoulders didn't carry that constant tension anymore. She stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner, simple as always. But this time, her hands were steady in a different way. Not controlled, not careful, just free. Sophia sat on the floor nearby, coloring, humming softly. That same little melody she always made up. But tonight it sounded brighter, like even she felt it, without fully understanding why. Andrew sat at the table, watching, not saying much, because he knew something important. This wasn't a moment to lead, it was a moment to let happen. "Mama," Sophia said suddenly, looking up from her drawing. Margaret turned. "Yes?" Sophia hesitated, then asked something simple, but powerful. "Are we staying here forever?" The question hung in the air, soft, but heavy. Margaret didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, she could, not with uncertainty, not with fear, but with choice. She looked at Andrew, then back at Sophia. "Yes," she said gently. "We are." Sophia smiled, not a big reaction, not excitement, just quiet happiness. And because for a child, forever doesn't need to be explained, it just needs to feel true. Dinner passed slowly, comfortably, conversation moving easily, Sophia talking about school, about a new word she learned. "Tomorrow," she said proudly. "I like that word." Andrew smiled. "Why?" Sophia thought for a moment. "Because it means something good is coming." Andrew didn't respond right away. because that was exactly what this was. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Margaret stood by the window again, the same place where so many of her thoughts had lived. But tonight, there were no heavy ones. Andrew stood beside her, not speaking, just present. "I don't feel afraid anymore," Margaret said quietly. Andrew nodded. "You shouldn't." A pause, then she added something else. "I didn't think that was possible." Andrew looked at her. "It is," he said, "when the right things are in place." Margaret smiled slightly. "Or the right people." That landed, not loudly, but clearly. Andrew didn't look away. "Margaret," he stopped for a second, choosing his words carefully, "because this part couldn't be rushed. I meant what I said earlier," he continued. "I don't want to be someone who just helped." A pause. "I want to stay." Margaret didn't interrupt, didn't react quickly, because this wasn't something she needed to answer fast. This was something she needed to feel. "You already have," she said softly. Andrew exhaled slowly, relief, but not surprise, because deep down, he already knew. In the other room, Sophia shifted in her sleep. Then a small voice came, half asleep. "Mama." Margaret turned immediately, walked to the bedroom. Andrew followed a step behind. Sophia sat up slightly, eyes still heavy. "A bad dream?" Margaret asked gently. Sophia shook her head. "No." She looked at Andrew, then back at Margaret, then asked, "Is he my dad?" The room went completely still. Time slowed, because this was the moment, the one that couldn't be planned, the one that couldn't be prepared for. Only felt. Margaret looked at Andrew. Andrew looked at her. No words, just understanding. Margaret stepped closer to the bed, sat down beside Sophia, took her hand. "Family isn't always how it starts," she said softly. "It's how it grows." Sophia looked at Andrew again, then reached out her hand, small, certain. "Then stay," she said. Andrew stepped forward, sat down, took her hand gently. "I will," he said. And in that moment, something real formed. Not perfect, not defined by titles, but stronger than that. Because it wasn't built on expectation, it was built on choice. Days passed, then weeks. And life didn't explode into something dramatic. It didn't become a perfect story. It became something better. Stable, routine, real. Margaret continued working, but now with confidence. Not survival, growth. Sophia started reading full sentences, laughing more, drawing bigger houses with more windows, and always 3 people. Andrew changed too. Less time in the office, more time at the apartment, not as a visitor, but as part of the rhythm. Dinners, mornings, school pickups sometimes, small things. But those are the things that matter most. One afternoon, Sophia ran out of school, straight into Andrew, hugged him tightly, then said something simple. "You came back." Andrew smiled. "I always will." Margaret watched from a few steps away, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was rebuilding something broken. She felt like she was living something new. That night, Sophia handed Andrew another drawing. He unfolded it slowly. The same house, but this time, there was something different. Above the door, she had written, "Home." Andrew looked at it, then at Margaret, and in that moment, there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect, because everything that mattered was already there. And as the lights in the apartment dimmed that night, as the city moved quietly outside, as 3 lives settled into something they had never expected to find, the story reached its true ending. Not the moment when the danger disappeared, not the moment when the problem was solved, but the moment when something stronger took its place. Because sometimes, a simple question in a bakery can lead to something no one saw coming. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of everything. And here's the truth. This story was never really about money. It was about a moment, one small decision that most people ignored, and one man who didn't. So now I want to ask you something real. If you were standing in that bakery, what would you have done? Would you walk away like everyone else or step forward? Because sometimes changing a life doesn't take everything you have. It just takes noticing. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And also, where are you watching from today? If this story touched you even a little, take 1 second to like and subscribe, because stories like this remind us who we can be.